This is our annual Cascieri lecture, and it gives me particular pleasure tonight to be able to introduce in just a moment Len Charney, who will carry forward with the program. But I have to add a personal note. My grandfather was Dutch. I grew up in a Dutch household in East Harlem. And in growing up, it struck me that it would be particularly interesting to have an opportunity to visit Holland, because I had learned even as a child growing up in New York about the remarkable things that the Dutch people had done with landscape and with architecture, building of the Zuiderzee and the ability to overcome huge environmental challenges in the 1950s and actually going back centuries. And so after a trip to Europe where I met with heads of design schools in Europe, and where I encountered some of the heads of some of the Dutch schools, I vowed that it would be important for us here at the BAC to try to develop some working relationships with folks in the Netherlands who have taken on some environmental challenges, some architectural challenges, and also some very interesting interior design challenges with the design of some early modernist furniture. And so we began a dialogue. And I was invited to Amsterdam several years ago to speak at the Academy in Amsterdam, where I met our speaker tonight, and we vowed that the BAC and the Academy would develop a closer relationship for one key reason, and that is that we found that we had more in common with each other in terms of our belief in practice-based education than we at the BAC have with any other design school in the United States. That in fact, the things that we stand to learn from each other as practice-based design educators who rely upon the strengths and the knowledge of working professionals as practicing faculty was something that we could build upon, and indeed we have already had a couple of our students who have been there. So tonight's lecture gives me great pleasure because it fulfills for me a goal that I've had for many years, to develop a close working relationship with designers in the Netherlands, and it also enables all of us to learn in very significant ways in holding up a mirror to ourselves how we can continue to make the BAC even better as a practice-based design school. And so with that, I want to introduce the head of our practice, Len Charney.
Good evening. Art Oxenaar's presentation of the 19th Cascieri Lectureship in the Humanities marks an important chapter in an unfolding story about two universities, two schools of design across from the Atlantic from each other, who share a similar philosophy and point of view. Both the BAC and the Amsterdam Academy of Architecture were founded more than 100 years ago as associations or clubs of architecture. Based on the time-honored tradition of apprenticeship, its members decided that the best way to prepare the next generation of its practitioners was to train themselves. Both have embraced concurrent learning, as you've heard, thus ensuring a continuum between the academy and the profession. Each has pursued excellence with a demonstrated willingness to invent, reinvent, and transform itself in the face of change and new opportunities. You've heard from Bernie how Don Brown traveled to Amsterdam, being wisely counseled by none other than Dean Cascieri and the Dutch modernist architect Backema. Clearly, Don's one-year Fulbright changed him and changed the school when he came back. At the core, it underscored the reason, the rationale for there to be this kind of partnership between the Dutch schools. In 2006, a delegation of 4 educators arrived relatively unannounced from the northern city of Groningen and Amsterdam, specifically to find out more about the BAC as well as to reignite the relationship between the two schools. There then came the invitation that Ted mentioned 2 years afterwards to address a group to celebrate the 100th birthday of the Academy of Architecture and participate in a symposium which was aptly entitled Reinventing the Academy. It was at that moment that I had the opportunity to meet with Aart Oxenaar. And I found that his extraordinary talents as a gracious, erudite, and effective leader had already changed the school since his directorship in 1998. His breadth and appetite for theory, research, and reflection had helped challenge the Academy to recast and modernize itself through significant curricular revisions. This past fall, I returned to Amsterdam specifically to see the ways in which we could re-engage and to set up different exchange programs. To date, 2 students had gone independently to Groningen to Amsterdam, but with no curricular agenda or outcomes. Eventually, we aspire to set up a program where, in fact, students, practitioners, and faculty will be working together, exchanging ideas. Aart's time with us for the next 24 hours will undoubtedly create a stronger link between our 2 institutions, and it would be chock-filled with various meetings between our students, our practitioners, and our faculty. And so you can see from everything that's been said that it has taken a while to get to this evening. And somewhere, I imagine, the dapper dean with his signature beret is sitting there somewhere with the bespectacled Bakema, thinking about what is about to come, and one turns to the other and says, "Eigentlich, it's about time." Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to present to you Dr. Aart Oxenaar.
Thank you very much, Len. Thank you very much, Ted Lensmark, for this great invitation. It's a very special moment indeed. I've done many presentations of our school, and actually I've always felt a little bit the odd man out. This is probably the first time that I'm presenting in a school where I know I do not have to explain much, because we work along the same idea, the same line. So that makes it a very special experience. What I will try to do in the coming hour is combine 2 presentations that I'm very used to giving. I present the school quite often, and I've been lecturing a lot about the history of Amsterdam. But what I have not done before is try to think and reflect on the impact of the school on the City of Amsterdam and the impact of the City of Amsterdam and its development on the school. And I think that story also tells us about the way these 2 interact. It tells us about the porousness of the academy. I do not know if this is a widely used term in English, but I learned it from David Porter from the Macintosh School, who once held this system we both share as an example, as exemplary for the way practice and education can relate. And he used the term porous. And I think it's actually a very interesting term, the porosity of the school towards the city and the other way around. Before I begin my story, I'll shortly introduce the 2 protagonists. First, the Academy, about which I can be short because you know the system, and then the City of Amsterdam, and then we'll look at a series of instances where this cooperation was particularly strong, and I'll end by trying to give you an idea of where we stand now. The school began, as Len already said, as an architects association. This was Architectura et Amicitia, architecture and friendship, a society of architects that still exists today. They had their 150th birthday a couple of years ago. They started in the 1850s, and it was from within this association that the idea came up that there should be a school of architecture in Amsterdam. And in a way, it still is that association. Here you see a picture of students and teachers gathering at our 50th anniversary. This is the gathering in a church close by the school at our 100th anniversary. Of course, you've already seen that Ted Lensmark and Len Charney are in the picture. And in fact, Janet, you must be in there as well. We still are how we began, and that is as I like to say, an academy of architecture, not the academy for architecture. We're an academy in the classical sense, a place where people get together to pass on knowledge to a next generation. And that still is very much the case. It's the place where architects meet to pass on their knowledge, their experience to a new generation of students. We do that in a very open system. We do have a program. The backbone of the program, of course, are the design projects, and then there are other elements we add. And the special column, which you usually do not see in any of the programs, is practice. I don't know if the ECTS system means anything to you, but we have 120 points academic training and 120 points working in practice. And shortly, that will also be enough to comply with the new demands. We have a change in the law for the period of professional practice. So it will allow students to register as an architect. Within this system, I think it's important to note that this group of teachers, this community of architects in the City of Amsterdam teaches, and none of them have tenure. We do not work with tenured staff. Each semester is designed as a new project. For that specific semester, we invite teachers to come in. Some are invited years in a row, some are invited for once. We have some 350 guest teachers come in each year. Some do one lecture, others do a whole project. We have 3 heads of the departments. We run a master's in architecture, in urbanism, and in landscape architecture. We also change the heads every 4 or 5 years, so that way they can bring in a new agenda. Each head comes in with the knowledge, I will be here for 4 or 5 years. What will be my agenda? What do I want to change in the direction the school is taking? So I think that's a very important aspect of an open school. I come back to that in the end of my presentation. Then there is the combination with practice. This was made by a graphic designer. When you asked him something, I asked him, could you make me a map of all the offices that our students work? I don't know if you understand it, I don't. But I think it works like this. He made inverted circles. So the outer circle is the City of Amsterdam. So here you see all the names of the offices that students work in Amsterdam. Architects' offices, landscape architecture offices, urban offices. And the more you move in, the further the distance from the school. And the maximum distance is about 150 kilometers. You can imagine why he did it. There were so many offices in Amsterdam. If you would have put them in the middle, it wouldn't have worked. But it's a graphic designer's choice, just to indicate to you how strong the ties with practice are. We have a wonderful building still in the center of Amsterdam. We've been there for some 60 years now. It used to be a place where food was stocked for the poor and handed out in this building. Now we hand out architects' diplomas. This is the inner court where the poor people would come in here, pass. I would be standing in the lecture hall, go out on the other side with their foods. We use it for workshops. This was a great workshop on light construction. A NASA engineer that came over won 7 kilos of material. He got 10 meters high, so that was the lightest construction. We redid the building just a couple of years ago, just before the centennial. Klaus and Kahn architects remodified the interior. But the essential part of the school, and that's what I want to show you, and Don Brown might remember this one, you were talking about it, is the bar. Here you see when the architect was still a gentleman. This is the new bar. We still designed the school in such a way that students, teachers, anybody in the school always goes in through the bar and comes out through the bar. And that makes for a very important informal moment. That's where we run the school. A lot of meetings are not necessary because the heads will hang at the bar and they will meet students, teachers, discuss. Students and teachers will meet. There is some beer and wine. I hear that this is still a dry school. We're not. And that really is an extremely important point in that community that we run. And here this is just to show you that we're in the center of Amsterdam. This connection to the city is very important. The school is right here. And since the late 80s, we've merged with a couple of other art schools in Amsterdam. We used to be an architects association. It was an association that owned the building, that ran the school of mere architects. Now we're part of an art school. this is film, this is theater, here are the liberal arts, they're just out here, are in the corner, and music recently built a new building right over there. So we're a bit on an arts school campus. And I think that's quite important. The model we work with, this concurrent model, which you all know, seems to be almost a rare bird nowadays. But as you all know, it used to be, in fact, the more normal way of teaching. Architecture began from an office, began from a practice. That's where apprentices would come in, and then slowly but surely they would start courses. All in the 17th, 18th century it was like that. It wasn't until the 19th century that this division sprang up of polytechnical training leading to an architect's diploma, and more art-oriented training leading to an architect's diploma. We are very happy to be part of an art school, to be close to this design tradition. I must explain though that we only do a master program. The students come in with a bachelor, and quite a few of them have a polytechnical bachelor's. So they do building technology first, and then they come to art school to become an architect. Just to give you a little idea of what the school is like. Then the second protagonist in this story would be the City of Amsterdam. It's almost an exemplary model of the development of a city. When I have first year students, we all take a bicycle and we just make a straight line through the city, because by making a straight line you come through all the aspects of an historical city. It begins with the organically grown medieval center, then we see the 17th century ring of canals, which is an ideal military concept, but also the city for an elite of burghers. They kind of moved all the illegal building, excuse me for saying they moved the shit within the walls a little bit, and made themselves some nice canals where they're living. And this is the working class section that was left over. Then the third line would be the 19th century, when there is a grid city encircling the existing city. So you could say it's a speculative 19th century. You make a simple grid that can be filled in as fast and cheap as possible. Then the 20th century, I would call the century of the social democratic city. The century when designers like Berlage, we will see Plan South here, and he did a section here also, redesigned the city, and when the modernists brought the concept of the finger city to Amsterdam. And then of course the last one, the last instance I will show is where the social democratic city changed into a PPP construction. I don't know if we use English words sometimes without knowing whether Americans use them at all. It's a public-private partnership. The last 20 years we've been reinventing the way we produce the city, and that's especially this whole section along the I estuary. Okay. The story begins 1908. That's when the Academy was founded. And this is the city as it was found then by Berlage, the designer you may have heard of, who made the first 20th century extension plan for Amsterdam. And there was one very important basis for this plan, and what really changed the way we produced the city, the speculative city of building blocks, of a grid, just concentrically built around this 17th century fortification, was changed in a plan that was founded on the housing law of 1901. And there were three very important elements. That was an expropriation law, so the city was able to expropriate land so as to have a decent new plan and a coherent development, but also keep the prices low so that the rents in the houses could be low. There was a subsidy for social housing, so here you see the social democratic city coming up. And very important in relation to the architects and the school, there was the obligation for each city to design an extension plan. So there had to be a designed plan. So this was the first, you could say, modern extension plan for the city of Amsterdam. You can also see that it began on a critical mood. The school began 1908 by Mr. William Kromhout, who wrote an article that said, tout à l'égout, everything down the drain. Let's get rid of all these neo-styles of the 19th century and start over. So he brought in to the school, the beginning school, a whole group of architects from the new art, the Nieuwe Kunst, the Art Nouveau generation around Berlage, started the school. And at the same time, Berlage said, down the drain with this speculative city, we have to build the city as a Gesamtkunstwerk. This is no longer a grid fit for speculation. What he's actually doing, and the best way described I ever heard it was by a German critic who said, mit dem Hausmaterial Raum gestalten. Use the housing material to create space. So all of a sudden it's the countermold of building that becomes the essential element of the city, and you create spaces, you create public spaces. Axes are very important. You will recognize elements of the City Beautiful movement in America. And monumental buildings mark the axis and mark public spaces. And each public building needed to have a public space. So this is a completely different city from the one that was merely for speculation. Here, well, in a way you could say it's thinking about how can we shape a public space for a new community. That was for a large part also built on social housing. An important element is this rather funny looking drawing. And this is where we see the school and the Berlageplan get together. This is the committee, the Amsterdam Beauty Committee, that was instated to build this plan. There was, you could say, a very strong coalition between the City of Amsterdam, the designers of the urbanists of the plan, Berlage, and the architects working there. And they succeeded in instating a beauty committee that controlled the building in that plan. And what they did is for each street, silhouettes were drawn. So they were not just making blocks, but they were trying to keep an eye on what is the perspective of each street. And architects, when making their plans, had to comply with the silhouette. So this street you can recognize is this silhouette. And that way they could construct a coherent city. And if you look at the people working in that Berlagian city, you will see the same names in what was the first program of the Academy of Architecture. But what makes it even more interesting, if you look at this list of teachers, I will not explain the whole program, not only do you see the leading generation of young architects building in that plan, but you also see two very important aldermen teaching in the school. So community politics were taught by the same alderman who was also responsible for instating the new housing policies. So this whole new concept of the city, the new theme of making streets rather than individual blocks, and the theme or the leitmotif of solving the housing problem, that was the big social task at hand, kind of found its way straightly into the school. And here you see some early student work, interpretations of the facades of a street, the Amsterdam school, which for a long time was seen as an expressionist architect, in fact is a very, I think, intelligent and exciting interpretation of the street wall, of the street facades, and an interpretation also of movement within the city. If we look at the final exam work of that period, it's still rather formal. The idea of a grand projet within the school still was strong. Slight connection there to the École des Beaux-Arts. This is work done by one of my predecessors as a director. And you can see a rather large-scale formal project. But the same people, this is Dick Greiner, one of the alumni of the school, working in this Amsterdam South area. So what actually happens is that you see teachers and students almost in a symbiotic cooperation producing this new city. This is a square where Anne Frank lived. The city, this new neighborhood came up in the 1930s, so quite a few people fleeing Germany came here. Again, an almost symbiotic relation between architects, teachers, and the city. The first critique came from within. It's quite interesting to see how this Porous Academy is changing, and where the first driving force in change is. This is the graduation plan of Cornelis van Eesteren. You may know him as the chairman of CIAM, the International Architects Congresses. He made a comment in his plan on Berlage's design. At that time already he had moved to Germany and he was studying at the Bauhaus in Weimar. Now we're very proud to say that this great chairman of the CIAM, foreman of modernism worldwide, was one of our students. At the time he was refused the diploma. Because the critique was this was not enough of a monumental plan. And then again he was reworking Berlage in a way that the exam committee did not agree with. So this is on the one hand a major moment in the history of the school, but at the same time also a very interesting moment in the constant need to keep an open attitude and be open to change. This is Van Eesteren teaching at the Bauhaus in Dessau, in Weimar, but very close afterwards he became the urban designer for Amsterdam. He was hired in 1928. So 1908 the school started, 1915 the Plan Berlage got underway. 1928 Van Eesteren was asked to come to Amsterdam and he redeveloped a complete new plan for the city. 1935 this plan came out. Like I said, the finger model, so no longer are we extending the city, but we are urbanizing the landscape. I think that was a very important switch in the way of thinking about urbanization. The landscape is taking into account, you see green zones cutting in between these fingers of the neighborhoods, and you see a complete different way of parceling. And interesting there though is that there is a mutual respect. What you see here is the edge of the Plan Berlage, the city of building blocks, mit dem Hausmaterial Raumgestalten. Here's a major street coming in, and if you look closely, you will see that Van Eesteren brings in the CIAM idea of an open planning. The Rue Corridor, as Le Corbusier called it, was one of the worst elements of the traditional city, in their view, that had to be gotten rid of. So here you see an open planning. So these Berlagian blocks are here slowly opened and go into a more open planning. At this time, interestingly enough, Van Eesteren was also invited to come teach in the school. So the Berlagian fortress, or this symbiotic relation, was still there, but nevertheless, the community carrying the academy was able to open the doors and let in the guy that they had first refused the diploma and allow him to teach a course in urbanism. So very slowly we see these new ideas, the CIAM ideas on urbanism, separation of functions, recreation, working, housing, and traffic are very strongly separated in these plans, and this intertwining of landscape and architecture comes into the plans. And here we see early 1930s, one of the first graduation plans where modernism comes in. And I read in one of the magazines of the Times a rather negative comment by one of the Amsterdam school teachers. He said, well, here this CIAM Corbusian dreams are coming in, where is this going to lead? But the school opened towards it. So apparently this community of architects and urbanists was able to open the doors to new visions. This is one of our first female students, 1935, but you see an immediate change in the exam work. Not so monumental anymore, not the idea of the grand projet, but the idea of solving a task at hand in a more friendly, modernist way. In practice, at the same moment, Amsterdam South still was the area where it was being built. Here we see a plan by Sansra Giese-Simons, a group of modernists, adjoining the Berlagian streets. It's a freestanding block, kind of awkwardly fitted in there, so they were allowed to work in South. The Beauty Committee let them in, but reluctantly. And as you can see, the building is not the usual concrete, glass and steel, but there is a brick facade. And this is one of the big monuments of Dutch modernism, the Buitenschool by Jan Duiker. But if you look closely, it's a school for asthmatic children, so they can be taught outside. But it's entirely encircled by one of the Berlagian building blocks. So modernism was allowed in, but koudgestellt, as the Germans say, made cold by encircling it. This was also an interesting period if we look a bit wider into Dutch architectural education. The academy was slowly opening towards modernism. Duiker was teaching here, Van Tije was teaching here, Van Eester was teaching here, Mart Stam, whom you may know as one of the guys who started the ABC. Delft at the same time was very much a vestige of traditionalism. Architecture was a craft. Craft was only done by building with materials that were naturally made, which came down to volumes, load-bearing brick constructions with traditional detailing. Whereas the modernist generation was going towards concrete skeletons and open facades. And there's an interesting moment, all through the 1930s we had quite a discussion to accept and get the school accepted. Because the traditionalists in Delft at some point chaired a committee from the Dutch Association of Architects that asked themselves the question, does the diploma of the academy lead to the title of architect? Should it lead to the title of architect? And that kind of hampered our development in that period, but you could also say we came out of it stronger. The school really had to prove itself. Can there be another way of teaching architects in combination with practice other than in an academic institution like Delft? The new generation went on to develop, and this name has already been mentioned quite a few times. This is the exam work of Jaap Bakema. It says here, the birth of an idea. Already by the way of drawing, you can see that there's a big change. No longer a grand projet, but a far more sketchy project in a different way of drawing, aiming much more at what is the idea that I want to sketch and what is the problem I am solving. Here's his project, not so monumental anymore, not so large scale. And Bakema, this must be him. Architects were still gentlemen then. He did a very interesting thing. In 1941, in the middle of the Second World War, when building stopped in the Netherlands, schools were closed, you had to join the Kulturkamer, so you had to join the Germans or you could not study. Bakema organized a meeting in Doorn, somewhere in the forest, to bring together the architects from the two schools, from Delft and from Amsterdam, traditionalists and modernists, to see if they could discuss the foundations of architecture and find a way to work together after the war. They could see there would be a period of reconstruction and that cooperation was needed. The term that came out of it was shake hands, a shake hands architecture. It worked and it didn't, but at least a mutual respect was formed there. So I think Bakema already then was a man that took initiatives, that brought people together, students and practicing architects discussing the future together in the middle of the war. That was quite a statement, that was quite a moment. After the war, Amsterdam picked up where it left off. The plan Van Eester made had not been executed in the 1930s. There was a crisis, there was not much development. After the war they picked up again. And here you see an interesting change. You may remember the students when Van Eester was in Dessau were wearing coats, white coats. Here also Van Eester is wearing a white coat. The architect here is changing his role. Van Eester saw architecture as a laboratory. He was experimenting, he was researching. The plan he made was very much on the Patrick Geddes idea of survey before plan. They made some 35 reports, scientific reports on demographic developments, on traffic development, on work, on whatever you can study, even how many churches of how many denominations will you need in a new city. Everything was researched. So he wanted urbanism to be founded on scientific research, and that's expressed in this coat he's wearing as a lab, as chief of the lab. He is working, by the way, with Mrs. Mulder, with whom they work together. The element of the city were quite sober after the war. There was a big problem. A lot of houses had to be built. The whole market in the Netherlands, up till the 1990s almost, 80s, 90s, was built on shortage. We had an enormous housing shortage, big political pressure to make more houses. So the aldermen were practical, said, we need to build, we got to start. What do we have? We have this plan by Van Eesteren. It's been accepted by the city government. Let's make it. So teams were formed. Van Eesteren was running the teams for each section in the plans. Supervisors were appointed. Architects were invited to work in those teams. And you will see that the whole generation, the first post-war generation of academy students, often within the offices, or some that had graduated just before the war and started after, filled in the plan. And it was almost like a well-organized rational machine churning out housing in a very high speed. The differences were in the parceling. Even traditionalists were put into this scheme of modernist parceling, the open parceling. They accepted it grudgingly, but they accepted it. This, by the way, is a blog by Dudok. In fact, one of the more monumental architects who had a lot of trouble accepting the fact that he could not make a rue corridor, that he could not make a closed block anymore, but they accepted it. It was a great machine. It was a well-run machine. These pictures I'm showing are maybe a little bit rhetoric, because they may look dull. They may look indeed like this rationalized machine producing a city. If you look closely now, and in fact I spend a lot of time working on it in different ways and advising about it, it's quite beautiful, especially the green is quite beautiful, but it is a bit monotonous. It is a lot of the same houses, so there are big changes going on now. But again, I want to say it's a bit easy to be negative about it. You see the system of what they call the organic neighborhood in open parcellation, so that there is an organic system of people living around a center, but everything in open planning. We see some of the buildings. This is Jaap Bakema. Simple, straightforward modernism. This is Groosman, an extremely prolific architect. He makes thousands and thousands of houses in this system. They look kind of dull now. In a way they were. It was very systematic, the one after the other. And the comments came, of course. In 1954, a group of architects got together preparing the new CM Congress. And in 1959, this is Jaap Bakema, this is Aldo van Eyck, these are Peter and Alison Smithen, came with a manifesto to critique the CM. In their feeling, it had gone out of hand. Urban planning and the production of the city had been far too much rationalized, and they should return to the concept of the city as also a place where social relations are formed. These are great drawings. There's a book Jaap Bakema did. It's called Van Stoel tot Stad, From Chair to City, and it actually was a television program. So for television, early 60s, it was, for us in Holland, it was the beginning of television, and here was this architect with these drawings explaining how do we live, what is a city. And if you look at these drawings, he begins with connections between people, translate that into connections between buildings, always introducing these themes of inside, outside, small, big, and then these elements are connected into larger cores or walls, which are then connected into nodes almost, which are then connected along traffic lines into a system of almost, what shall we say, villages, which then ended up in a plan he made for Amsterdam, the Pampas plan. Here's the old city, and we're going out into the water. So we see an island here. There's this enormous infrastructural line connecting all these elements. The core wall is a very much Bakema theme, carrying the plan. I'm spending a bit more time on Bakema because he played an important role in discussing the future of your school. Frankly speaking, I must say by this time he had already left Amsterdam and left the academy and had become a professor in Delft. And it was in fact the other critic of the CIAM, Aldo van Eyck, who stayed at the academy, was the major figure of what has been called the Foreign Group, or also has been called a group of structuralists that turned out a fabulous series of magazines that presented the story of another thought. Also Van Eyck rejected this large-scale, almost automatic churning out of a city. He got famous with an article that is called the Anonymous Client and the big word no. So we should stop churning out these flat blocks and turn back to the question, can architecture be used to shape social relations? And here he was a very brilliant rhetoric with two pictures. This is Amsterdam West, Van Heesteren, and this is a simple picture of what happens in Italy on the street. And it says, qu'il nous est difficile. How hard is it? Or how hard can it be? Why do we make this if this is what we want? And how shall we do it? And in a very poetic way, he criticized his time and came up with new ideas. His father, by the way, was a poet, so this poetic way of doing what came not out of nothing. These are the Otterlo circles. He presented them at the last SIA meeting in Otterlo in the middle of the Netherlands, criticizing again the way Siam had been thinking about city. We could talk about this for an hour, I will not do that. But it says here, when is architecture going to reconcile essential aspects? We can discover ourselves everywhere, in all places and ages, doing the same things in a different way, feeling the same differently, reacting differently to the same. And then he very often uses examples from more tribal cultures, where the idea of a cohesive society is much stronger. And they went to Africa. They traveled a lot to the Dogon, which is where they got many of their ideas. Van Eyck, by the way, was working for Van Heesteren in the city office of Amsterdam, as was Bakema. So you always see these interconnections between school, practice, students that learn in the school, but also work in offices of practitioners that were trained in the school. This is one of the, we could say, prize pupils of Van Heesteren, of Van Eyck. Here again you see the comment on the existing parcellation of the modernist city, and the answer is a completely different structure. In fact, this is work by Piet Blom, and he is the one who introduced this term of structuralism for their architecture as a comment on the way neighborhoods were put together. And his simple theme was, each neighborhood should be like a little village. And it reflects on the term that Aldo van Eyck used, a house is a small city, a city is a big house. It comes from Alberti, but Van Eyck, for him, that really was one of his basic sayings and his basic comments on modernism. And Piet Blom did not grow up on the canals, but in this section of Amsterdam, the Jordaan, the working class area, jam-packed with people in the post-war period. Houses were simply, were in very bad state, some were almost falling apart. And the plans were, we cannot imagine now, imagine this is all 17th century development, the plan was ready to raise the entire section. 1964, the plan was made, it was all going to be torn down. And that's one of the things that the generation of students that grew up under Aldo van Eyck very much aimed at. It's the time of Jane Jacobs. Boston, in that sense, was very much a beginning also of protesting these kinds of changes in the city. A whole new generation of students grew up protesting, counteracting this idea that the historical city was done with, that it should be modernized, and large-scale destruction should follow. So here's a plan Piet Blom made of a very compact structure. His idea was what he always said, we should live on the roof of the city. The bottom can be used for parking, all kinds of infrastructure, and we will live on top of that in very compact structures. Ironically, this project was built. but not in Amsterdam and not in the Jordaan, but way out in the east of the Netherlands, in a meadow somewhere, so in a very suburban setting where it became a very interesting object. In fact, it's going to be a monument pretty soon if we don't careful, but not exactly on the spot where it was meant. But the protest was not without reason. Try to imagine, these are the canals, this is a 17th century street. In the 1960s, Amsterdam decided to build a subway line, but as Amsterdam is built on mud, you cannot drill. Now we have a technique that we can drill, we didn't have then. So it's built by concrete caissons, these enormous concrete elements sink in the mud, but it does mean that you have to tear down everything on top of it. This is the Academy building, we're right here. So this enormous destruction came towards the Academy, encircled us. Here you see the Academy in the middle, here's one of these concrete blocks. The subway came past us, and the idea was that on top of the first part of the subway line going into the city, there would be a 4-lane highway. You know all these theories about the cities that should be disclosed by large-scale highways, and this is the moment when the protest broke out. Interestingly enough, this building is on a street planned by Van Eesteren. This is one of these 4-lane highways going into the city. It was built by one of our students. The next generation of students protested this kind of development. So across the street here, the next generation of students built. So here all of a sudden you see how the one generation within the school, with their offices, gets to oppose the next generation with their offices. So all of a sudden the debate is very much in the school, and well, as you can see, we were in the middle of the debate. This is the side of the school when they were building a tunnel. This is when the subway was going in. Try to imagine these were all 17th century developments. And this is what happened when I first came to Amsterdam. 1980, riots broke out because people really thought this must stop. And interestingly, the Academy is right here, and in our big classroom up here, architects bonded with the inhabitants of the neighborhoods and discussed alternatives. So all of a sudden, the architects turned against this planning machine, turned against the urban developments, which were, let's face it, were done in full integrity. It's not that Van Eesteren had gone wild and was doing things, but their concepts, how shall we say it, were outdated, were discussed, or did not take into account enough of the urban structure and most of all the people living there. So the critique came on very strongly. This is the existing plan. Here's the Academy for finishing the street on top of the subway line. And this is the alternative plan that Aldo van Eyck developed with some of his younger employees that were at the same time studying in the school. So here again, Van Eyck teaching in the school, but also having students from the school in his office, develops a whole counterplan for the existing plans for the development of Amsterdam. And here we get some graduation works, two great students from that period, Paul de Leij and Theo Bos. And what you see them do here is make reconstructions, analyses plus reconstructions. These are the 17th century islands. And very carefully going back to traditional profiles and see if they can develop housing typologies that allow social housing, complying with the rules for social housing, to fit within this historic structure. This is work done by Theo Bos, who later became the partner of Aldo van Eyck. It's quite interesting to see how graduation work is also presented in a very informal way. There was an enormous anti-monumentality at that time. We were discussing some projects last night where it was very interesting. A group of your students now is working on Paul Rudolph, and we came to the discussion where Dutch structuralism and Paul Rudolph share things, but there's also an important difference. Dutch structuralism always had a great problem with monumentality. That, of course, was a bit something that came out of the war, a fear for monumental architecture representing power, whereas Paul Rudolph, having lived always in a more democratic situation, was not so scared to make more monumental gestures. So here you see a young generation rebelling against the urban plans for Amsterdam, rebelling against, or starting a rebellion also against the planning office. The Amsterdam planning office under Van Eester was functioning extremely well, so well that it became a machine that rolled out the plans too easily and was stopped. These are Helder van Eyck, Theo Bos buildings, reconstructing the Jordaan area. This is, you can see it's pretty late, 86. They were reconstructing the Waterlooplein area, very close to the school. We're right behind here. And the role of the architect changed. We've seen the architect as a gentleman. We've seen the architect with his laboratory coat as a researcher. And here we see the architect. These are two architects. They are siding with the neighborhood. So all of a sudden, the work of the architect finds place in the back room of some cafe in the Waterlooplein area, discussing with the inhabitants. Here they have one of these speakers. The glasses are going around, and they were very heavy, long-going discussions. But very interesting, because his role changes, and they really took it very seriously. They said, we no longer stand for this anonymous building industry. We stand for the interests of the inhabitants of the city. How can we, with the inhabitants, redevelop the city? It was an exciting time. It was an interesting time. In Delft, in a way, it was even more radicalized. There they wanted to stop the whole idea of architecture, because an architect was a bourgeois aesthete. He was a slave of the building industrial complex. The whole idea of architecture should stop, and it should be translated into, well, it's very difficult to translate, verblijftuigbouwkunde. It's an extremely funny word. It's something like habitatology or something like that. Architecture was finished. Bourgeois activity. Well, you cannot say that these guys were bourgeois. We must admit, it turned out extremely well, extremely good people that reorganized the way we renovate our city. The whole urban renewal process started up in the 70s and 80s very, very well. It did not turn out a great generation of architects as far as designers. They were very good at reorganizing neighborhoods. In fact, we had some students that got famous with a report they made that even got to the Secretary of State, where they proved that reconstructing a neighborhood would be cheaper than rebuilding it. So the Secretary read it and said, do it. But that was not, of course, the design. So in the 80s, luckily, postmodernism came by. The doors went open again for design. There was a certain return to order in the sense that architecture and urbanism as a discipline in itself could be studied again, and we see students turning back to somewhat more monumental plans, and we even see something as bourgeois as prizes come up again. So all the Dutch schools got together and they started the Archipri, which is a national competition for the best graduation work. These were two winners in the late 80s. And in fact, next month we developed it into the Archipri International. Next month at MIT there will be the exhibition of the Archipri International. So it's now a worldwide competition of graduation work. And also in urbanism, you see students turning towards the traditions of the discipline and picking up again design, not in a formalist way, but in an analytical way, seeing, trying to find out, are there historical elements in the city that we can reuse to redevelop. I already told you that in the 90s there was a major change in Amsterdam. The time of the what you see is what you get plans was over. If you looked at the maquettes of Amsterdam West in the time of Van Eester, maquette and production were almost one-on-one the same, because there was total direction from the city. In the 90s, when the redevelopment of the waterfront began, it was found out that that did not work anymore. We moved on to public-private partnerships. This is a design, made by Rem Koolhaas for the Amsterdam waterfront, and this is no longer a what you see is what you get plan, but they use the way of drawing from comic strips, comic books, to make clear that these are plans, are drawings meant to sell the plan, to interest developers rather than to express exactly this is what it's going to be. The waterfront maatschappij exploded, it didn't work, but in the end what we did is section by section, this whole waterfront of Amsterdam was redeveloped under these entirely new conditions. Plans were made in smaller elements. This 1, 2, 3, 4 architects worked on it. Consortia were formed where market parties, investors, building contractors, housing corporations had to make bids together with architects, and in open competitions, sections of these plans were executed. For American standards, maybe a relatively normal way of doing, for us something very new. So this top-down direction of the urban offices in the cities changed, and private market parties got a major role in making this city. I'll quickly go over the elements that we find here. You see that each island has its own concept. This is the one done by Jo Koenen. He takes up the grands ensemble of the 19th century and reintroduces large building blocks. Interestingly enough, he also brought in quite a series of international architects. This is Hans Koolhof, this is Bruno Albert, this is Roger Diener, also to renew this architectural culture in the Netherlands. This is a plan by Stuart Soeters, who was head of the Department of Architecture in our school. He reintroduces, in fact, the traditional Amsterdam canal block with an outside and an inside, even the Achterhuis, where Anne Frank lived, that element is brought back. And he reintroduces canals, anathema for the modernists ever to use a historic element like a canal. That was historicism, that was fake. Well, actually people love it and they're very successful. And then Adriaan Geuze, the West 8 office, did the last section, and in a way he reinvented the Jordaan. You see this sea of very compact houses, and in the middle some big building blocks. He used the metaphor of the 17th century silhouettes of Dutch cities, where you see the sea of houses and then a big church sits in there. But it's not a church, it's just housing. And I don't know if I can use the F word here, but he said, well, this is the sea of houses, and those are the big motherfuckers sitting in the middle. A lot of research was done because this is a 100 apartments per hectare, so it's an extremely high density. So Rudy Uiterhaak, who was then teaching at the academy with groups of young architects, did a whole series of analytical studies. How can we reinvent this extremely compact types of housing? And here you see the results of a whole new types of building blocks, all including parking, so it's either under it or in it. And this is Herman Zijnstra, one of our teachers, building there. And it shows also a change in the attitude that came in the 90s. When I first came to the school, came in the 20th century. When I first came to the school in 98, conceptual thinking was still very strong. Making a concept was very much the thing. What you see change in the last 10 years is from making a concept to conceptualizing of the making. There's a return to interest in the craftsmanship of the architect, the precision of the making, which fits this kind of urban plans. Here we see the three concepts one more time. This one was done by one of our students. So what we see here is a city produced in a completely new way. No longer this very strong symbiosis between city architects we saw in the Amsterdam School. No longer these, what you see is what you get plans where supervisors more or less hand out the plans and the housing corporations build, but a far more open situation where in competitions, where in public-private partnerships, sections of the city are built. And the last plan I'll show you is going along the same system. The new islands of Eiburg. This is the harbor area I was showing you. And here we go out into the A estuary, which is actually where Jaap Bakema was planning his Pampas plan. And in the late 90s, early 21st century, 2000, the beginning of 2000, a plan for a series of islands was developed here. Again, built according to this public-private partnership concept. Interesting enough, we first made land, and then we made it into islands again. So here you see canals coming in, and there's a couple of canals made here, because it's faster and more practical. And there was a quality team. I don't know if you recognize it, but I was on the quality team, which was no longer, like in the time of Van Eesteren, top-down making the plan, but there was a grid on the island. Each party, consisting of an architect with a developer and often a housing corporation, would present its plan, put it in a maquette, and it would be discussed in the team. So it's quite an interesting way of producing the city. And again, you see both teachers. This is Ton Schaap, who was the urban designer, student of the school. Felix Klaus teaching in the school. These are students from the school. So I would experience that we would sit there on the quality team. An architect teaching in the school would present his plan, and his assistant would be one of the students. So again, here is this multi-layered relationship between school and city, but in a far more open situation. Here we see Ton Schaap, one of our students, looking over his empty island and taking into, looking at his plan. A tiny little but interesting thing. The first generation of students, of inhabitants, did not want to come. They said, who's going to live on this island? It was like a sandy colony way out, until it happened to be a very nice summer. And a young lady came with a brilliant idea to start a beach there. And that was the best thing you could ever do. No advertising firm could ever have come up with that idea. There was a beach in the summer, and the whole generation that they wanted to start living on the island spent the summer there, and all of a sudden discovered that actually these islands were wonderful. So they're being built now, step by step. You see, in fact, and that's quite interesting, a return to the grid structure. Within these new public-private partnership constructions, the building block is actually a very practical element, because then you can discuss the city block by block, and it can change according to the market. Sorry, this section, for instance, the market is slacking, and discussion is now going if in this section more low-rise will be built. So this kind of, in fact, 19th century grid structure in a more modern version with more discussion on quality and cohesion is very usable in a modern market situation. So here we see a quite important change in our relation to the city. Now to end, where do we stand now? How do we keep this porosity going in this far more open market situation? We do different things. One thing we've been doing for quite a while is semester themes. Each first semester we discuss with the City of Amsterdam what is a theme that is relevant for you now. And we invite all teachers to join in that theme. They do their normal elements that fit within the program of studies. But, for instance, we've all been working on a new subway line that's being built. We've been working on reconstructing this Wieboudstraat I showed you. We've been working on the theme of water in the city. So that's one way of keeping in touch with what are the developments coming in the city. Another is we've been developing research. I will not go into that too long because that's a lecture in itself. But we've been developing practice-oriented research. We got some money from the state for research, and other than instating professorships, we look at what's going on in practice, where do we see teachers or people in practice doing interesting things, and can we, by giving them some money from the school, give time to do research. So we did a project on the street, we did a project on the use of brick in urban context, we did a project, a lectureship on the idea of a living landscape, complete new concept of landscapes. And one thing we do, and that's an interesting way of seeing how students within the school look at the problems of the city, we have a system where the students choose their own graduation topic. They have to write their brief, they choose their own mentor, they choose their own committee, which are mostly people from outside the school, but are architects. And in the themes they choose, you can see what themes they think are relevant in the city to work on. So if we look at a series of recent graduation work, this is a student working on a multicultural society. He's making a graveyard for Muslim people, which is in fact being executed now. This is a student who works on city branding, the idea how do you give this new generation of people coming into town the possibilities to identify with their own houses. He started an office which is very successful now doing shops, I'm afraid. We have a student that is working on the reconstruction of the 1950s flat buildings. I showed you these air pictures of all these row houses. They're 40, 50 years old now, so either they're torn down or renovated. We have a student that's working on public space in Amsterdam South, very sharp, there's a large-scale new development now. We have a student that's working on one of the few leftover open spaces in the 17th century city and see if you can develop housing without parking in the streets, so very compact housing. And we have students that deal with a larger scale water problem. This is a plan for a bypass between two rivers, because in the end Amsterdam is in the delta of the Rhine and the Meuse River. So the city is very much part of this whole water system. This is a landscape architect who's making this enormous bypass that at times of high water, when there's a lot coming down, this will be opened and this landscape will be flooded. So it can be a landscape park at one moment, water at the next. And here is a student who came up with an alternative for the major dike we built to close off the inner sea. We have a problem now that the sea level is raising, but also there's more water coming down the rivers all the time, so it's pressing from two sides, which means that you cannot get rid of the water going out when the sea level is going up. And he uses the idea of reverberation. If a wave goes in, it moves back and sucks out water. And he came up with a very interesting plan that you could use that natural move in the sea to have more water flow out. He won a prize from the Ministry of Waterworks, but I'm quite sure they'll never execute it. And this is a student who made a plan to insert a bathhouse in an electric plant. He said, if we're producing so much heat, why not use it again? So you see the themes of the multicultural society, of sustainability, of reuse, and of water problems. Students all address these themes. Because where I want to end is where do we stand as a school, or where do I stand as a manager, or a dean, or a provost of the school? Because we've been looking at all these themes, we've been looking at style, we've been looking at views on how to develop the city, we've been looking at the roles of the architect, but in the end, my job, and what many of you do here, is to run a school, and to run it in such a way that we keep this spiral going. The spiral of a student becoming a practitioner, the practitioner becoming a teacher, the teacher bringing about a new generation of students. How do we keep that spiral alive? And I think one of the great ways of doing that is by having this open group of teachers come into the school and pass on the profession from one generation to the next. If this spiral leads to the stars, I do not know. But I think it is a great way to at least assure that we deliver students that are ready for the tasks at hand. Thank you very much. I hope I wasn't too long.
Oh, you fine. No one was sleeping. Thank you. It was it's wonderful to just hear the way the school developed, to really understand and to think of ourselves and how we've developed, and some of the parallels that you can see in terms of the timing of different things that happened, and also understand why Don would come back at the time that he did and find or rediscover different ways that the school could emerge. One of the things that I'm wondering about as I hear you talk is that the partnership with the firms. And it seems that in a time of Van Eyck, it was easier because the connections were direct in terms of the students working and then working in the firms. Particularly now, and we've talked a little bit about this, and you've talked a little bit about the research, and we've talked about the Gateway Initiative and what we've done. How are you strengthening that partnership? I mean, where is it right now in terms of the students' involvement? How has what's been going on in the economy affected that partnership, and how are you keeping it going?
Well, thank you for asking. I didn't want to put that in the story to make it even longer, but yes, we are experiencing, let's face it, a very serious crisis. About 50% of architects in the Netherlands are out of work now. We had an incredible boom end of the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century. This is not a great time. At the same time, it's interesting to see that relatively among our students, unemployment is much lower. First-year students, half of them had no work when they began. All of them found some kind of work now. But I have to say some kind of work, because it used to be they all had contracts, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. Now they have contracts 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, or they have internships. And indeed, we've done something very comparable to what you've been doing. We started what we call practice ateliers. We sat together when the crisis broke out with the officers. I invited them over and said, please come talk to us, what are we going to do? It was great to see that this idea of an association still lives. All these architects and firms still very much have the feeling this school is our school. I'm allowed to run it, but it's their school. And I think that that's very important. So they all came and discussed with us and said, how are we going to do this? They literally said, well, I have 6 tables empty. I can have 6 students come in. What shall we do? And we developed more research-oriented projects where within the offices on non-commercial tasks, because it cannot compete with the normal work, on non-commercial tasks, they will dive into subjects that the office normally has no time for. So we had interesting examples. One firm that works for homes for the elderly. There are a lot of demented people now, and Alzheimer's is strong. We're all getting older. How can you develop housing for Alzheimer patients? With a progressing disease, what kind of space would be more fitted? Normally they just go by the rules. They have to build these homes for the elderly according to rules. Now they had time to reflect on it. Another one said, I want to go into passive housing. Can we develop that? A third one said, are we building the right apartments for the right sector in the market? So they did research among young families. What is your family, how is it consisted? How's your family built up? What kind of space would you need? How would you like to live? So these kind of more research-oriented possibilities come up now all of a sudden.
And the government is subsidizing that research, as I understand. There are small grants available, there's some support.
There's some support. The state architect supported some of these ateliers, as she calls them. I must say mostly now it's the offices that's supporting it. So we have some support from the state, but most comes from the offices, which, well, again, show a great relation to the school by doing this.
I imagine that there are lots of questions
Yes.
from the audience, and I believe there's...
I think you were first.
Lindsay's got a microphone, she can go around. Please, if you have a question, come to the center and ask. We'd love to hear what you're wondering.
I think he was first. But, okay.
Thank you. I was fascinated by what I understood was your relationship with the city, and that you talked about going to the city and saying, well, what is the vision for this coming year, the next several years, and that you have this very open relationship with them as a design arm for the city. Have I understood that correctly? Can you elaborate a little bit on how you have this connection with the city?
Yeah, it's important to know that there is a city development office. It started in the time of Berlage. There was public works and there was urban development. In the 1960s, they developed into one big public administrative service. Got so strong that indeed it was rolling out these plans over the city that led to the protest, and it was broken up again into different parts. But still there is a strong urban design office. And the management is separated now, but urban design is still a strong city-initiated theme. So they make, how do you say that, structural visions for the development of the city, usually every 5 years. They make a new general vision, how should the city grow, on what themes. And we have very direct contacts with the designers, for the simple reason that quite a few of them are former students of ours. One of them is a former head of the urban design department. So that way there's a close-by urban relation. They happen to be across the street as well with their office. So they come teach. They have students of us working there. In fact, they have a very positive attitude towards the school. When young people come in, they urge them to get a master's in the school, give them room to do it, sometimes even pay the tuition. So that makes a very strong back and forth relationship, and makes it easy to just walk over and say, okay, what are you working on? What could be interesting for the students to work on? What are new things?
Herb?
It wouldn't have been all that long ago that a Boston firm would have been very involved in Boston problems, and an Amsterdam firm would have been involved in Amsterdam problems. But now it's just as likely that a Boston firm and an Amsterdam firm will be competing for a job in Bahrain. What does that do to this concept of porosity?
That's very interesting. You're absolutely right. Like I said, the basis to porosity changed enormously when these public-private partnerships came about, when the market started playing a different role. Many Dutch firms try to work in Bahrain or in China or wherever. I must admit, not many succeed. It's a small number. We see quite a few firms now trying to work on a European level. I don't know if ever any of you tried, but competing in Europe is quite complicated and has intricate demands. So if I look at all the architects I see here, but also the clients, this is the director of the Urban Development Office of Amsterdam. This is the director of a big housing corporation. This is a project developer. That's the mayor of Amsterdam. So they all get together here. There still is a relatively close-knit network of Amsterdam offices working either in Amsterdam or working for housing corporations or having relationships with project developers. And there still is a relatively lively architectural culture that project developers and housing corporations think the thing to do is to invite young architects and do, for instance, study projects for them. So yes, you're right, it's going to be a very open market. It's changing, and in fact the Netherlands have been, well, deliberately going into that by inviting many foreign architects to come in to open up our architectural culture. But at the same time, I do not really see Dutch offices yet operating on such really an open worldwide market. But I always say what happens in America happens in Europe 25, 30 years later. It will come. We know it will come.
We have time for a couple more questions.
As somebody who is interested in public transport and also somebody who used to live near Amsterdam, I'm curious about public transport and sustainability in general.
Mm-hmm.
I know that after the Bijlmermeer line was built, that there were no more building on the metro. How is that currently proceeding, and also what is the view of the school on sustainability?
That's an interesting one. As far as the metro is going, we are building a new metro line now. I think it costs double now what was planned, or maybe 3 times, because there's a new technique. There's a new drilling technique. You freeze the underground and you can drill now in the mud very deep. So it's extremely deep drilling. And all what happens is that the stations come up, so you have to make building pits. So there is a new technical possibility to do it. The broader theme of sustainability, well, that's one of the themes where this porosity is very important, where I showed you all this work students are doing now for their graduation. There you see the new themes coming in. Reuse is very important. Less will be torn down, more will have to be reused. Interior and interior development will probably be more important as a theme that students work on. I must admit we are very much design-oriented, so if it comes down to the technical sides of it, that's not something we really specialize in, but we are aware of it. So, am I doing this? So it's definitely a theme we will have to deal with. But what's interesting, we had a long discussion with 4 European schools. We tried to get a European program together, these Erasmus Mundus programs, where with a series of European schools you make like a traveling master's program. The theme was sustainability, but we deliberately said design, sustainability and design. We think, especially as an art school connected design school, the question we should ask is, what do new techniques, new developments in sustainability mean for the designer? Where does it affect or change the role of designer, or where does it put new challenges for him or her, other than be, as an architecture and a design school, in the forefront of developing new techniques?
Mika was asking, how do you manage the work that's being done in the firms? How do you know what's being taught, what's being learned, when you've got the number of students working remotely?
Well, that's a very good question. For a long time, especially in the times of Aldo van Eyck, in that period, it was fairly informal. They were counting hours and seeing, are they working enough time? And there may have been some report. Some 8 years ago, when this whole discussion started on a new title law in the Netherlands, where a period of professional practice of 2 years was going to be mandatory, we started rethinking the way we do exactly this. How are we monitoring? How do we know what's going on in the offices? Do we have enough of an idea on it? And we do that through portfolios. So students make a yearly portfolio, what they do in work. The patron or the mentor in the office signs for it. So he does the check, is this indeed what the student has been doing? The student writes kind of a personal reflection on what he has been doing, and then the portfolio plus these reflections are judged by an exam committee in the school. So they present their portfolio to external examiners that come to the school and that look at the development. And that in itself, again, is part of the year exam. So we have a system where students each year show all their work. We don't just go module after module, but we also look at the integral development of the student. Once a year there's an exam where you hang all your work, and they also look at your development in practice. So there can be an integral view on what's actually happening. And it will be a bit more, how do you say that, more precise or more bureaucratic, because the state is now developing kind of a way to check what should happen in practice. So they're making kind of the demands for this period of professional practice. I don't know yet what will come out of that.
And I would just, as an afterthought about that process, in terms of the partnership or the exchange between the Dutch schools, it's interesting to note that one of the things that has already happened as a result of going over and seeing the process that Aart has described is that we've returned and started to rethink our own assessment. And so those of you who have been having to go through practice examinations and submit portfolios and sit down one-on-one, I mean, that was lifted directly from the experience that we had as we went over and observed what was going on in the Netherlands. So before the partnership has begun, we have begun.
And as a matter of fact, we at times do advise students to go to another office. If we see that they're not developing, or that within the office where they are, there are not enough possibilities for them to develop further, we can advise them and say, try somewhere else, move.
I'm very interested in this privatization that happened with the public-private partnerships. Is there any view that this is an enclosure of the commons away from Dutch social democracy? And if anything, do you have a critique of that? And then also, does the school have any connections with social movements of oppressed people or neighborhoods or NGOs, in addition to the corporate and practice relationships?
Well, that's a lot of questions at the same time. Where shall I begin? Do we have contacts with neighborhoods? Yes and no, not as strong anymore as it was in the 60s. We do not have battle calls in the school anymore. And luckily, we don't see the water cannons come by anymore. There is a renewed interest in this kind of neighborhood-oriented projects. This year we have Jeanne van Heeswijk, who is an artist as artist in residence. We also have an artist in residence project. And she's an artist that works internationally very much in neighborhood-oriented projects. She's being asked more and more around Europe now. For instance, this summer there will be a workshop that our students are doing in Enfield. The football lovers among you will know Enfield as the Enfield Stadium. There's a whole neighborhood there, 1,000 houses that was supposed to be torn down and a new neighborhood built for those people with a new stadium. The new stadium is not going to be built. The neighborhood is partly empty, for the large part empty, but the old age pensioners are still there in a rundown neighborhood. So now students with Jeanne van Heeswijk will do a workshop like how can you retain some form of a livable circumstance in that kind of a neighborhood. So yes, in a way we're back to where we began in the 60s. How do I react to this public-private partnership? Well, it's the new reality. It's as simple as that. It's the way the city is produced. In a way, we could say we're still lucky because there's a lot of direction still from the urban design offices. I was on this quality team. This team still exists. I mean, it's quite special that this kind of regie, how do you say that, from the city on the quality, the urban design quality, the architectural quality is still there. So that part of the social democratic tradition is still in place. It's being discussed and rediscussed each time and again. But for the moment, especially in the City of Amsterdam and in quite a few of the larger cities, it's still a tradition that people keep up. But I agree with you, there is worry also within the urban design office. In fact, also among this generation that was trained in our school and is working there. Will we have somebody taking our jobs once we move out? That is a question.
I think Don's going to have to wait with his question until the larger reception that will follow this. We like to show our gratitude to our speakers, and I would say our particular gratitude to Aart Oxenaar as a person who has inspired us around the way we think about teaching and learning, particularly in practice and particularly in the midst of a city, and particularly with students who are so engaged in reshaping not only this city but others here and elsewhere. And we do that each year by awarding you with a medal. And so if Bernie Goba, as chair of the Cascieri committee, and Russ Feldman, as chair of our board, would come up, please.
Thank you so much for your attention.
We have a reception downstairs. Art will be here. We can talk about hydrology or Amsterdam or building types or pedagogy or learning and practice, but we'll all be downstairs with light refreshments. Thank you all again for coming.